There is always a part of me when I like reflect on disability that wants to time travel a little bit and just go back and be like, can you stop? Can you stop? Because I wasn't, it's that weird thing where like I wasn't okay for so much of it. But like, so like my career was like, and I was like, I think I used to talk about myself as like a artist in a box. So like my producer would like open the top of the box and I would like jump out and do a show. And she'd like put me back in and I'd be like,
So I've never really formally acknowledged it.
I think I've always, like, for a long time as well, kind of resisted that title, or that kind of, yeah, being labelled as having a disability or a chronic illness.
So it's definitely partly about my health, but it is also about other people's attitudes and the way that things that people will say to you.
And it's a really complicated question, and I'm still coming to terms with it. My diagnosis was 3.5 years ago. And it's really difficult because, on the other hand, my life is more like someone who's chronically ill, who has periods of going, actually, I'm not affected by it, it's fine. Other than, you know, obviously mentally and knowing you've got this sword of Damocles over your head, but you can get over that. But physically you go, actually, I'm all right at the minute, like I'm fine. And then the next day be like, oh no, I'm short of breath, or I've got fatigue levels and whatever.
I was having a chat with my mum about this the other day, actually, and she was like, "Oh, you're not disabled, you know." And there was kind of this idea of like, in order to be disabled, you need to be the right kind of disabled, to have like a disabled badge for parking in your car, or you need walking sticks, or something. I was like, it's a bit more complicated. So there's this huge like weird. I even had it today before we got on the call, where I was like, "Oh, am I just not ill enough to be useful to this conversation?"
You know, it shouldn't ever be the case that stops you from saying how you feel or saying what you need. But the fear definitely is there that I would miss out on opportunities if I was to say, you know, I can do all these things and I'm there, but actually I need you to put these things in place. Like whenever I do need something, I kind of sometimes tend to like approach it in a bit of a jokey way. Like, you know, it'll be like, oh yeah, maybe you could create a little nap room for me, or I could just and really, like, that is what I need. But to kind of, I don't really know how to talk about it seriously, I don't think.
That perception of a director floundering makes me really nervous in terms of people not trusting me to do the job that I know I can do well.
I would have just completely given up. And so I don't, in terms of you looking, which is great, at how people with disability, particularly chronic illness disability, can sustain a career in the arts, I would say I reached a point 6 or 7 years ago where the answer absolutely seemed to be you cannot.
I feel a lot of responsibility in my health and the job that I do, that I need to be telling people, but I'm not confident enough to do that yet, because I'm worried about not getting work because of it.
I think it's interesting. I think it comes back to that. Here's what people should be, right? Here's the useful way of people. And then, oh no, these people can't do anything at all, right? They're disabled. We'd hate them. They're useless to us. So we discard those people. And then there's chronically ill people who come in the middle and are sometimes one and sometimes the other. And the problem is this, you know, we are a spectrum. Everyone is incapacitated or disabled in some way. And the point is, I think, to make society and physically being in spaces and mentally being in spaces as accessible as possible for everyone. So society is for everyone, but for some reason we've made it for a small group of people who perform at their best, like in a certain way all the time. And I don't think it's applicable, and I don't think it's true. And that's where these division lines come in.
The exposing of bad behaviour is quite useful for the institutions. because for those who have not been found yet can use that as the quick measure of what they can do to change their ways.
So when I was applying for drama school, I will not name names, but I was at an interview, and male interviewer, female interviewer. The male interviewer, I mentioned I had lupus. I don't know why, it just came up. And he was like, oh, well, you can't be a director with lupus. Obviously, I did not get a second interview with that institution. But he was just like, well, you can't be a director. I think there's that feeling of, if you're lucky enough to get those opportunities, you have to like bend and contort yourself to fit into their boxes. And if you can't, well, then there's plenty of other people who'd happily have that job. And it's, again, it's that mindset to me that is just really problematic.
Running ourselves ragged, trying to make this work happen. And obviously, like, my mental health was just like, so for a while I was in a sort of like manic, having a manic episode, and that sort of powered the work for a while. But then there was a huge crash and everything fell apart, and we had a really difficult time getting out of that contract and being paid for the work that we'd done, and had some really horrible interactions with the venue about whether we were cut out to work in the arts or not, whether we were suitable or not. It was really bad. It's really bad. And I didn't have the tools and the language I have now to like know that was ableism and call it out.
Why is there a line there when we should just be, everyone should be in, we should all be together making things work for everyone. And that's why there's that weird barrier between chronic illness and disability, and these just shouldn't be here. That's what I think, between all three groups.
Yeah.
I'm nervous about, especially, say, working with people who don't know me, or what do I need to explain at the beginning of a rehearsal process so that when those moments happen, those actors who need to feel in a safe pair of hands with me as the director at the helm, and the rest of the team as well, don't panic and go, this person doesn't know what they're doing, but rather understands this person has a condition where sometimes their brain checks out for a bit. I'm cautious, and I place it carefully, because I've had responses like that previous employer who said, oh no, the chief exec would be angry at another disabled person coming to work here.
It just feels like for most people that they think it's just going to be more work.
I can't guarantee that I'll be well the whole time, but usually I'll work out a way to, manage life around that job.
Yeah, I kind of take it a bit on myself to openly tell people, to mention it all the time. And that's partly to do with me coming to terms with it as well, but it's to do with saying, just to put my access needs right out there front and centre. And also because people are terrified of talking about cancer. They think, oh God, well, if you've got cancer, you must be literally about to die tomorrow, or why haven't you lost all your hair yet? Or, there's so many myths around it. But yeah, it's really, so I think, long way round of saying I'm not sure yet, and I'm also I haven't quite figured out what's best for me either, if that makes sense. Do you know what I mean? I've certainly got anxiety around it. So yeah.
But yeah, I think there's a fear, especially with something where you are tired, like where tiredness is the main symptom. Like, I don't ever want to be seen as lazy. Like, I think that's a massive fear of mine.
And so I decided that I wanted to make a show called Salt, and that was really huge and ambitious. And a big part of it was a 2-month R&D that was like retracing a route of the transatlantic slave trade. So sailed to Ghana, then flew to Jamaica, and then sailed back to the UK. But it was really, really, really difficult on my mental health. And I think, even though I'm so proud of Salt and it was so good for me, I do think it really threw my body out of whack. I don't think that my particularly like the first half of that trip was really difficult. We were in like an environment where we were sort of scared all the time, and people that were looking after us were quite aggressive. So within a sort of year of coming back, I had noticed I kept having these like jumps in time, and I was like, I don't think it's disassociation. It doesn't feel like disassociation. So then got an epilepsy diagnosis. But then around the same time that we got the epilepsy diagnosis, Salt went to Edinburgh for a month, which was good. But then it had loads of international touring dates while I was trying to get my epilepsy medication right. So that was like a wild year. Oh my God, it was such a wild year. And then when we came back, we tried to make another piece, and that fell apart completely. And that was definitely ableism and really hard. And then I got a chronic fatigue syndrome diagnosis. But at that point we were like, let's do things differently. So I like hired an access assistant, and we were changing how we were doing pay, and we were changing our timetable. Yeah.
Because it is psychologically, it is a different thing when it feels like someone's opened the door a bit for you to then go, oh, okay, I will then come forward with what's specific and personal for me in terms of access, versus having to start by knocking on the door and hoping they'll even open it. But it still needs to be room for a two-way conversation, because as we've talked about, every individual's needs are so different. And what's not helpful is when a venue or an employer or a company or whoever assumes what your needs are and then gets it wrong. So I think it ultimately does have to be a two-way conversation.
I think it's really interesting what you were saying before. It's about transparency and what people are coming out, and and privacy, and shouldn't have to kind of tell your business about what's going down. But I love an access rider. It really helps me to know what is required for people to be the best they can be within the space, and what's needed for me to adjust in order to support the full team.
Oh, that's a very good question, and a very good way of putting the question. No, I don't think a director has to be physically present or in the room in order to direct. I don't think that's necessary. I think it's been proven that it's not necessary. I think there is something that can happen when you get bodies in a room, which is hard to put your finger on. It's hard to articulate in words, but a little bit of magic can happen. And it would be very interesting to see if suddenly everybody was having to stay at home and all work could only be made via a screen, whether we would get the same variety and richness of theatrical experience. I suspect we'd be losing out on something, but that doesn't mean that we'd be gaining an awful lot as well. So I just think the blended model is the way forward, because there's pros and cons to everything in life. So so I sort of feel, no, a director doesn't have to be in the room, but I do think something can then happen when you get bodies in the room as well. Does that answer? That's a tricky question.
Some of the time, yes. But in terms of an entire rehearsal process, no, I don't think they need to be there the whole time.
Oh no, because I work internationally, so I've had the pleasure of working British Council Venezuela, and I know there was a connection with artists regardless of the miles. I know this to be true because of my own personal experience. My family are in the Caribbean. You have to make that work. You have to find a way. So one of the whole Zoom thing of disconnect. I mean, I've had directors telling me that you can't audition, you can't do that, and look what we had to learn quick. Yes, you can. You find a way. I mean, I've had a real joy with Zoom. I mean, you've got to be, with any tool, you've got to be careful with it and not overuse it and not break it. But you can also use it to your advantage. It's a great opportunity. For those of us who were isolated unnecessarily, Zoom is a great opportunity for people to be connected in a way that we should have been beforehand.
There's two slightly different things there as well, aren't there? Because whether it's, if the audience is going to experience it digitally, then it should be, presumably, it's useful to create it digitally. But if you're just creating it digitally for an in-person audience, does that, you know, I don't know, I suspect that wouldn't always work.
So I think yes, my answer overall would be, yeah, I think that you can be present without being physically present in a rehearsal space if the model is clear about what that space is for and what your role within it is or not, if you know what I mean.
What is hardest about not having the director in the room? I think the hardest thing is that there is lots of communicating that we are doing with our bodies all the time that we're not necessarily aware of. And it can be really tricky to be in like dialogue and in communion without that feed of like information that you're not necessarily conscious that you're giving and not necessarily conscious that you're taking back.
But there's definitely also bits of the process that don't need to be in the room. Like, it feels like there's lots, it definitely feels like I in the future might have mixed processes where some of the like chat and discussion and like text work or like just like playing around with stuff, I think even for something that's going to be in a space for an audience that's in the space, maybe you don't need to be in the room all of the time.
That's an artistic question, right? And the answer is yes. The question that's more interesting to me is how, right? And how does that like shape the work? And how is that actually really exciting and full of like possibility and potential?
Yes, I mean, I however, do you know, because of all the different work I've been doing, I've also been just ahead directing scenes. So literally, I mean, the people I was working with had a great time, you know, and they were brilliant, and it was very focused. But again, quite short sessions. I don't think you can maintain that throughout an entire day, just having this sort of Gary's head telling you where to stand. That wasn't just what I did, but telling you what to do, you know, and working the scene with the actors. But that was a maximum 90-minute session, because after that things just become a little bit whoa, not only for the actors but for myself as well.
I think that there are times when it's appropriate and times when it works. Like, you could do a read through, for example, or you could do text work. But I definitely think there are times when being physically present is just such a boost to energy.
I think at the centre of the question is resource. So, you know, subsidy is declining. So our local authority subsidy is declining year on year. The Arts Council funding has been, well, more or less at a standstill. So real terms has been frozen, I guess, for several years. But also the demands of the Arts Council have increased. So I think the financial model is complex. So what that means is that, you know, we could, for example, only do 2 session tech days, so just work 10 till 6 rather than 10 till 10. But that would cost money. And if that's costing more money, that money has to come from somewhere else. So, you know, we could maybe then do 1 less production a year, I suppose. But that means the audience is getting to experience 1 less production a year. And we're employing 1 less writer, 1 less director, 1 less designer, etc., less per year. So the money has to come from somewhere. So it's partly to do with resource, definitely. I do think it's also, and it's the only model I've ever known, it feels like there was something to do with an energy behind a sort of, as you get nearer, you know, the tech, and then nearer the first preview, and then nearer opening night, there's something that happens to the adrenaline and the energy of everybody driving towards that common goal, which I think can sometimes ignite a production. But there's a cost to it, isn't there? There's a mental and physical cost to it. for everybody involved, you know, and maybe particularly more so for deaf and disabled artists, for those who are caring, those who are parents, and actually for everybody involved, because I think there's also burnout does exist in our industry. And the problem with that is, in order to have a sustainable career as a freelancer, you need to do so many jobs a year. So it's not that you can work incredibly hard for 3 months on a production and then take 3 months off to recover. I mean, even that probably presumably wouldn't be mentally, emotionally, or physically that healthy, but at least it would be offset in some way, shape, or form. But you can't even really allow yourself that if you want a sustainable career. So I don't think it is that sustainable as a process. But I think unless we get unless we really relook at how we fund the arts in this country, I don't see it making a significant shift anytime soon. But maybe that's naive.
Somebody started it and everybody else followed. I mean, that's what I think. You know, it's an industry that, I mean, maybe it's guilt. Maybe they think, oh my God, I'm here in this dream space and I've got to look like I'm working and being busy. Otherwise people will be, you know, I've got to go back down to the factory. I don't know. I think there's something there about people's personal practice. There's a lot of busy doing nothing. There's a lot of hours spent with actual if you had the, you know, care and take and time and this and that, and then the carry on 50 hours and the actual end product, same thing. So what is the point of that? I think there's a lot of anxiety around being seen to do, and that's not just down to theatre. That's just the way that sometimes our country works in terms of industry. You know, pick up a broom, make sure you've been seen doing what you're doing. I mean, I'm up for excellence, and you know, I have a company with Shirley Harris called Vanitas Arts, and we have been absolutely known to push, but we don't push beyond what's possible. You know, I do believe in my own personal choice and practice that the gold is in that extra place, but that does not mean 16-hour days, because that's not going to be good for me.
So I think there's something about like being the hero or something like that, and I think it's probably tied up a lot in capitalist models of human resources rather than human beings, and showing how resilient a resource you can be, being valuable, because it's more important to have value than inherent worth. I think that's probably a lot of where it comes from, yeah.
What seems to me is a value judgment that is made, which is, if I'm being crude about it, you are getting paid money to be an actor, an artist. That means that money you need to earn, and you need to work as hard as possible for the 2 weeks, 3 weeks, however long you've got, in order to prove that you deserve this money, not only for yourself, because work is hard to come by, but also just to prove to everyone that you are a worker.
When you're running a building, it's even worse, because you're expected, all right, could you just check your emails from 7 till like 8:30? And then could you have a meeting with finance from 8:30 to 9:30? And then at 9:30, could you just bob into marketing till 10 o'clock? And then you could do your rehearsal 10 to 1. Then we'll have a production meeting 1 till 2. And then 2 till 6, you'll go back into rehearsals. And then at 6 o'clock, can you pick up a phone call with X? And it's just, you know, it is just impossible for anyone, not for particularly for people who are carers or chronically ill or whatever, just for anyone. It's really, really tricky.
I think that it's about the people who get into leadership positions are almost always people who have very few barriers, are very privileged people, you know, tend to be neurotypical, able-bodied, white men, you know, every point. And things tend to work how they want them to work quickly. And it's all done in that way. And everyone just has to follow the model, rather than there being a discussion about it or seeing how things can work flexibly. I think a lot of it is leadership. And I think one of the things that is changing now is there is more leadership in smaller organizations from people who have been disabled by the way of working.
I think it's about the tradition, this oh, it's the way it's always been done. And also because there's, you know, more people wanting to work in theatre than there are jobs, it's about who has the most energy to get it, who puts in the hardest work. And that's, yeah, whoever works the hardest is the best. And the hardest in terms of like the amount of hours, the amount of slog, you know, who's the most tired, which is just, yeah, terrible, and not in other jobs. And yeah.
No, until we can get to a place where the money people are comfortable with people having time off, I can't see that moving forward. It has to happen. It has to happen. But this seems like maybe possibly what will happen is that there will be a distinction between what we describe as sort of West End shows, or fully funded RSC shows. And then the shows that come from the community, or people who want to do small scale theatre. Now, artistically, I don't think there is a distinction. I think there's good and there's not good. And I think the process that I would do for performances, for big number one tours that I've done, are the same as the process that I would do for TIE shows, young people's theatre, community performances, or indeed directing at drama schools.
Yeah. So I think, so yeah, I'm still at the whim of producers to an extent, in terms of what that, if you're thinking about overall structure and the way that the whole thing works. So I think that this is sort of pre-COVID, because things did change, and they have, with the things that I'm now doing, which I'll explain in a minute. But before that, I think there was a tension emerging for me between the structures that producers were asking me to work in terms of like, I need you to build a show in 3 weeks or 2 weeks or 4 weeks, you know, sometimes 3 weeks for big shows, where it was Monday to Saturday. And so one example would be a West End show, big West End show. They wanted us to do it in 3 weeks, maybe it was just under 4, but it was like the 4 bit was like when you're moving into getting it into the theatre sort of thing. So it was really 3 weeks, and they were wanting to work Saturdays. And that was when I was associate with Richard Eyre, and he and 3 of the cast had children a little bit older than mine. And there was all sorts of really interesting conversations about that. And kind of the way it worked in the end was that the Richard just said no to Saturdays, apart from one, I think, that was sort of negotiated with the company that they really wanted it, and it was a short day. And we also did short rehearsal days with short breaks, which is also really challenging. So that was really interesting, and it did help, you know, people who were at in a really physically well space to be able to have that energy to come in and work from 11 till 4 or whatever it was, with a very short break in the middle. But then some people were really grumbly about that as well, because they didn't feel they had a chance to rest. I was still sort of breastfeeding, so it was complicated. Yeah, so it was so, but I was really pleased to see an old school kind of director thinking about how we work differently that might sort of suit people. And he was really flexible, as much as you can be. And what I think really helped was the actors, a lot of work happened before they came in. And I think you can do that. So they came in and they were just like fully off book, and it was just really, and they were just real pros. So I feel like that sort of worked, and we managed to get it there. But that was because we were trying to squeeze something in that worked within a really unhelpful time frame, from big producers who are like, but then they're like, well, we're going to make loads of money off this. So it's a really weird scenario. And I think, but you know, I've been trying in my own practice, when I've been in processes and had the opportunity on smaller scale things to have a say in the process, been asking for more time or things to be spread out over a longer period. And producers obviously don't like it, because, and it's tough on actors, because you can't pay them for the full week, or the producer's saying, well, I'm going to pay them I have to pay them for the full week. I can't pay them for 3 days or whatever. So that was always kind of contentious, but I did manage it a little bit, and I was able to be flexible within the room with people and their needs. And an actor who I worked with a while ago sort of introduced me to the idea of access riders, which I'd not heard of, which I feel like I'm still relatively new as a conversation, and that she was working with Grey Eye at developing. And we talked a lot about that and what that would look like. And I was at that point where I was interested in how that might support me and other parents. And I feel as though I was doing that previously in my work, but it's really hard to know until you're genuinely in it as a parent. And the same goes for anything, right? For disability, exactly what the reality of that is.
Because I always say the majority of people are affected by something that would be helped with greater access. Almost all of us will be affected by disability. Like almost every single person will be affected by disability in their life. And that's just one of these barriers to access. So the way that we think about it is all wrong, and it's all there's an aspect to it that's like, just to kind of go out with it, but there's an aspect of like industrialization to it, which came from like, this is how we do it, and we can just have that always, and need this kind of Victorian sensibility where everything is a way and you fit into this way, but if you don't, then you're out, kind of thing. And I think that just carries on to this day, and we're sort of starting to hopefully reject that a bit.
Shorter working hours is a big one, and I think that will depend that will look different for different people, whether that's for some people only doing a 2 or 3 day week, and for other people it's happy to do a 5 or 6 day week, but I want to be finished by 4.
It's a really weird one. It feels like there's one half of the industry that's the Arts Council side of the industry, who are the subsidised side, who are having these conversations, trying to develop these models. And then you have the more commercial arm who are sort of doing the opposite, where they're kind of cramming things in further, and they're sort of, there's a sense of gratefulness and all of that that's coming in even more, that was there anyway, right? Just be happy that you're doing something. So yeah, it's and you can feel the frustration at being asked to talk about flexibility, and it doesn't stop, even if you feel really strongly as I do, that it's not about, it's the opposite of what they think it is. It's not an issue. It's like, it's going to create a much better product. It's going to, if you're thinking of that focus, like it's a commercial way of thinking, if you frame it right, of going, this is how we get the best product for everyone. But it still feels really, I don't want to say the word triggering, but it just feels suddenly all of your anxieties and vulnerabilities of feeling already like you're not quite able to do the job because you feel like you've got your hands tied, just feels like it gets turned up, and that can only do something really bad to your confidence, it just has a knock on, doesn't it? When you have those really conversations that make you feel really vulnerable, that are public, where you feel like you're really having to manage yourself to not kind of come back at them in like a really unhelpful way.
I think one of the many problems that we have in theatre is that it's very person reliant, like the people in the room take on an importance that they don't necessarily, if you're in an office team, you've got your blend of personalities and characters, but if somebody leaves and somebody else comes in, there's a brief transition and then you get used to it and move on. Whereas in theatre, it feels like this kind of cult personality, but it's over everybody, like everybody's so important. Like you can't just swap an actor, you can't swap a director. It's a big deal.
But I think the idea of like an advocate, as well as like how we model like leadership in a room, is really, really good, because I think like how we discuss the role, because there's a whole conversation around assistants and associate roles as well. Like, what are those jobs and what do they look like? Because I think there's like an advocate role, like you know, because all I was thinking then was like, how can I speak? How can I support? How can we support each other? There's times when I need someone, when I'm exhausted, to sort of, you know, hold up the stick for me and shake it. And then it's like, well, how can I do that for other people when they're having that day or that period where they're not as able to be as vocal or as noisy and haven't got the energy? And then it's like, yeah, within a space, how do we reframe or understand those jobs of assistant and associate? And we kind of maybe need to just try and reframe the old-fashioned way of thinking that it's sort of like a way in and a lesser job where you're learning. It's like, no, maybe it's just a different role within a room, which is kind of, and maybe it's a gender thing, but I always see that when I'm working with an assistant, we're doing different jobs, and my respect for them is as much as I would respect another creative. They may have on paper, if you know, which is often the case, you know, they may be from a drama school or, you know, but they're going to come in with so much more knowledge that I don't have. So the way that works in a space in terms of hierarchy or whatever is how you manage it. So I just think there's maybe that as well. It's like, how does those collaborations work in a room?
So to give you an example, so the last show that we made, I had a co-director because I'd just come out of a period of not being very well with my cancer. And so I just didn't know what my fatigue levels were going to be like. So I felt like the model at in the building couldn't change because it had been predetermined however many months and even years ago when we planned that production. And I suppose, and because of COVID and whatever, we put in that co-director to support me. In the reality, it wasn't needed as much as I thought I would need it. But I think what I'm going to do moving forwards is actually, and I'm probably in the best position to be able to do it. I appreciate that sometimes, I don't know though, but sometimes I think when you're a freelancer, you don't have this ability because you're at the behest of whoever's paying the money. But then also if you're making your own work, then actually you can make the model that suits you. When you're in a building, it's really difficult because there's so many other things that are dependent on it and departments that are linked into it. And to suddenly change a model that has been, you know, kind of ingrained in that building for so long is really difficult.
So the first part of it is that I work with an access assistant. Her name is Tony D, and she is also an artist. And that was really important to me, that I wanted to work with somebody that had an artistic practice, but was also really invested in the models of care that I was looking at that were coming out of like disability justice and disability activism that was happening in the States. So Tony accompanies me on any of the work that's making. She knows the projects as well as I do. And what it means is that if something happens and I can't be there, but it has to happen because of the timetable, Tony can step in and lead. So a real tension for me in my practice is that a lot of the work that we do is socially engaged, and we're working with people who are seen to be difficult to interact with. They're not, venues are just lazy. But I know that like being reliable and doing the things you said you were going to do are a really important part of socially engaged practice. But reliability is very complicated when you have a chronic illness, particularly something like CFS. So that's the first thing that we're constantly trying to, that was why it felt so important to have an artist as that access assistant, so that if I can't be there, but there's a workshop that needs leading, or there's something like what we were doing last week where we were doing breathing exercises in the park with people and recording them, Tony can step in and do that. So she's an access assistant, especially when we're touring, but an associate artist as well as an access assistant when we're making. I think the model we probably want to get to, if we can get more money, is splitting those two roles more officially. So having an associate artist and an access assistant, because the only difficulty is if I'm ill and need care and Tony needs to be leading on something, which also happened last week. So we have an access rider, which lays out what my conditions are and how long diagnoses have been in place. We try to be really transparent about the fact that all of it is a work in progress. So we are learning about what making art, working with the people that we want to work with, and having these conditions looks like. We're also really transparent about the fact that everybody on our team is neurodiverse or has a chronic illness or has something else that brings them under the disability umbrella. So we try to create an environment where everybody can come to work and be as whole and as transparent about their working practice as they need to be.
But when I did the drama school jobs, what they did was they did a 5, was it 5? One of them was 6 weeks, and I did 3 days a week in person, and we had 1 day online, 1 half day online. And it was so good to have that extra time. Like, and I remember I put a tweet out saying, I think we should normalize 3 to 4 day a week contact over 5 or 6 weeks as an overall model of working, because you do a better show. So, you know, just to kind of counter that like perception of like, it's a lesser quality thing, the longer you have to work on it, the time away is just as valuable, I think, from the thing.
I think it's changing. It's certainly within my lifetime, so far, my creative lifetime, I've seen some differences, but not enough. It needs to be moved. And, you know, we've got some really good tools to use. And I'm looking forward to seeing what happens in the next era.
As well as that type of work, I've been directing at RADA. Now, there is a fascinating process, because not only are you working on the play itself, but they also have other lessons going on at the same time. So on the BA course, you would have 4 weeks rehearsal with them, but that's not full time, because they've also got other lessons that are happening. With the foundation course, it's a 10-week rehearsal process where I did a day and a half a week, usually Thursday afternoon and all day Fridays. And then at the end of that, they have one really brilliantly, I think, high-charged moment where they share the play just once in front of the rest of their peers and all the members of staff who've been working with them over the year.
Everything that we book, we insist it all needs to be flexible hotels, flexible train tickets. Like, people never understand why we insist on that, and I'm like, yeah, when we have to cancel something short notice, then you'll understand. We have a really big access budget. When we first started out, we were like, oh, £5,000 a year might be all right for access. And then at the end of the year, we looked at our numbers and we'd spent 20k on access. So that's the budget that we have.
We're doing a project at the moment called Glad Game with one of our associate artists, and she has incurable brain cancer. It's a one-woman show about the journey of having incurable brain cancer. And we're really having to look at the access requirements of that performer in terms of working hours, how long she can work, what we need to put in place in terms of her being able to rest. She's going through chemo, so looking at being very, very flexible just in the scheduling of that, the whole process, actually, the production process, the prep, the rehearsals, and indeed the performances. I was looking the other day at whether we could do 2 show days, you know, and what that means. And the conclusion is, you know, we're working with the artist and the director and the producer, is that we can, but we need to start the matinee much earlier and the evening later, and there needs to be a proper rest period and somewhere to rest. You know, and that's been a real, I was going to say steep learning curve. It's not that steep just because we are a member of Ramps on the Moon, but we certainly are having to really think in a different way around it. So I think it's perfectly possible to adjust. You just have to be open to it. I feel like as an industry, we're moving towards that.
My practice has always been with care at the centre of it, because I had to ensure that I had everything in place for myself, you know, and so that kind of very definite care for the people who are in my charge. But really, I started with my, you know, that whole kind of, if you're going on a plane, make sure that you've got the seatbelt on and the person next, you know, that kind of thing was really, really important to my practice. I wouldn't have been able to do what I do. I was, a carer of 2 small children. When I started in my career, there was kind of organisation for, kind of childcare, all sorts of things that I understood in my world needed to be put in place before I could even step into a rehearsal room. And so with that in mind, I kind of had to consider what others may have to think about before they could get into the room. So my kind of thing was always, let's not make any assumptions that we've got here and all is well. We're in the room, well done, before we kind of get on to our next adventure. So in terms of changing my practice, what I'm going to say is it's been an absolute delight to see that practice that I learned from others now being centre stage after all this time.
And you think of the world that we're in at the moment, we have an opportunity here, but you said, to be honest, even in the last couple of weeks, I've started to notice just a little shift has started to happen again. Whereas before it was all, okay, we can just take our time and, blah. Now suddenly it's just a bit like, okay, let's get this done. Yeah. By Friday. I'm just going, oh, it's starting again. Like this pervasive quality of target-driven theatre. I can sense it. I mean, I don't know if you've noticed it in your line of work at the moment, but I'm definitely feeling that results are starting to become really important again.
Here's the challenge, right? You have to be willing and able to walk away if a venue's not going to agree to that, and that's where things get really dicey. So with all of this, Salt's a really popular work. So and people really want it. So it's a really powerful bargaining chip. It makes it very easy for me to turn around and be like, well, they won't agree to pay us half the fee and cover our expenses, even if I'm sick and we have to cancel the show. So we can't do it. It's too much of a risk for us to do it. So we can't do it. But venues really want it.
Worth noting there is also that we need to create a culture and have the conversations of allowing those to fail as well, because I think that there'll be a pressure to go, well, you want to do this new way, it better be brilliant. And it's like, it's maybe not going to be. And there might be times where this model is going to fall short, and it's going to mean that work isn't ready or is it's different. And that there needs to be space allowed for that as well, because that's the whole thing. And that's, for me, that feeds back into that sort of glass, what do they call it? The glass, not the ceiling, there's the next one, isn't there? They call it the glass ledge or something. It's like, you get the opportunity and it's like, well, you're going to, and it goes with the same when it's sort of around supporting diverse groups and things. It's like, well, here's the thing, unless you do it perfectly, then we've proven our point. And I think that that's a massive cultural shift of going, when we do try new things, they're going to fail. We're going to have to do some learning, and it's going to take a while. So we've got to be really, because I think that could then put, again, that undue pressure on those individuals. It always falls down to being on the individuals. Someone like yourself, you're suddenly going, well, we've given you the model, now do a brilliant job.
I'm particularly interested in pace, not interested in kind of any more round table, chatting. Action is always the key. And for those of us who've had to face that discrimination, centre them into the decision making and leadership.
It all starts with the people at the top of the building. If your executive director and your artistic director have got bad working practices, then the whole building's going to have bad working practices. And I think it's as simple as that.
I think there definitely will be some shift, but I think it's a long road, specifically for chronic illness. I think people only just know little bits about it.
They're going to listen. We're talking about a societal change. It's about the social model. It's an utter disgrace if that's not the case, because we are all in society and it's not even the right. It's just what it is. Any other way is just not the way, because what you're saying then is actually whatever the constructors decided is the norm, which is no such thing, is the only way, and everybody else is excluded, and that's just absolutely not acceptable in any shape or form, let alone the fact that they're paying tax and paying for the subsidised situation, and so everybody has the right to be part of that. But just in terms of our society, is that who we want to be? You know, in terms of, oh, it's hard work because we can't. It's not hard work. It's what it is. It's what it is. You know, and it goes right through education, through health, through every factor of our societal, section, pie chart, whatever. There's no room for exclusion because you can't be bothered to do the work. You know, it's not extra work. It's what it is.
It's hard to know and hard to speak for the industry around disability, but my feeling is really optimistic in terms of the people that I've spoke to and the producers and leaders that I have conversations with. They're all, and it's not tokenistic, they're all 1,000%, have engaged in trying to, if they don't have those experiences themselves in any way, like really trying to understand it and working with artists to understand it. So I'm really optimistic generally. And then looking at seeing more commercial models, piloting ways of work like that, being able to job share, which I think is a really interesting proposition that I think as someone, I'm like, if any job comes up and I'm thinking, oh, I'd like to go for that, that's more a leadership job, I'm always asking colleagues going, do you want to go together and propose a job share? Because to me, I'm like, I don't, number one, feel like it's necessarily good to have just one person. My feeling is, and maybe this is a gendered, like, female way of thinking, maybe it's very personal to me, maybe it's a bit of both, but I feel like those things work best when collaborated on. And a couple of director friends I've talked to, we've discussed like co-directing and what that might look like how would that model work, how would we co-direct, and actually the idea of it has felt really exciting. We haven't quite got there, but I'm really I'm really interested in having those chats, because I think stuff like that feels could feel a really productive way of supporting and maybe bettering the work, having two heads on it.
I think the only way that you ever change a system is by creating a new system that is better and makes the old system obsolete. So I think that what is happening and will continue happening is that, as is always the way, women, largely mothers, people with disabilities, and people of colour, and people who are making work that is exploring trauma are going to build new models, and eventually they'll be copied and adopted by other people because they'll work better.
I don't know what the answers are, but I think it's about having more frequent conversations and being able to flag up having a bad day without it feeling like you're causing a fuss or you've reached crisis point and you're not going to be able to carry on with the project, whatever that might be. I think so often, so many of us just try and hide things for so long, or kind of, or laugh it off in so many ways that then it feels really difficult to admit when you have a hard day.
That whole thing, isn't it? We're disabled by society. It's not someone has a disability and that's their thing to deal with. We've made this, we can make it better. And we can make it so that people aren't disabled by the things the barriers that we have put in.
That we can do the job just as well as other people. That we can, some of us are better, that sometimes all we need is a bit more time. Sometimes what we need is a bit more than that, but like, it's worth it.
I think it's going to take the bigger theatres and then the smaller theatres, and I include ourselves in that, to start trialing some of this to see how it works. But it's just really difficult, isn't it? Because theatre is so expensive to make.
And I think the biggest sector worry I have is like, what happens if you don't have the salt? If you don't have a big shiny Fabergé egg that people want, how are you still able to negotiate in that way? I never want to forget that salt enables me to do that. Do you know what I mean?
Just conversations, as I just don't think they happen, and it feels like you used the term earlier, coming out, and I think that's exactly what it is. It when you feel like you've got to hold something back and then admit it as kind of almost like a flaw of yours, that's really hard. And it, you know, I feel like quite often the way that things come out, whether that, and over time, like my narcolepsy is, you know, especially before I was diagnosed, like had a massive effect on my mental health as well, obviously, because like being exhausted all the time and not being able to stay awake for more than 20 minutes at a time is like really detrimental to being, you know, healthy and happy. And so, and I think quite often these things don't come out of people until it's reached a crisis point, and it's, you know, and it should never be that, but it is.
We're going to we need to make work that is more genuinely inclusive, like in a really broad way. And for it to be genuinely inclusive, there needs to be the time to have conversations and build trust.
So I think it does feel like, in terms of the current landscape and the way things are done, there does need to be change. But I totally believe that change is possible, and that some of the kind of smaller independent companies and people who are more open to doing things differently are proving that it's possible.
Well, listening's the main thing, isn't it? Rather than forcing your model onto other people, asking what model works for them, what they need, how they can work effectively. People have been saying for ages, I need flexible working, I need remote working so I can do my job better. And now that that's had to happen, you've seen that people have been much better at their jobs.
I am optimistic. I think I am optimistic that things can change.
I think that there are people with an appetite to change. They're just not necessarily the people in traditional positions of power.
What producer is going to say, oh, that's great, let's give Gary 3 days off now? I maybe it feels like a paradigm shift needs to happen.
But also, like with a more kind of hard-hearted way, I think you get the best work out of people when they feel looked after and are not stressed and exhausted. And I don't think that should be radical to think that way, you know.
I think there's going to be a lot more push to change things, and that's correct. Because it's been a long time coming, really. Yeah.